She thought the stranger blocking her wagon was there to take everything she had. But in one heartbeat, one look, he saw something that would change his life forever. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the wide, dusty trail that wound like a ribbon through the Kansas plains. Its fading light turned the world to gold, casting long shadows from the lone cottonwoods that dotted the horizon. A horse's slow, steady trot broke the silence, accompanied by the soft creak of wagon wheels. Charlotte Hayes, just 22, sat at the reins. Her dress, simple but neatly kept, was streaked with the dust of a long journey. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on the road, but her mind wandered to the small farmstead she had left behind in Missouri. She was headed west to join her cousin near Abilene, carrying with her little more than a trunk of belongings, a few jars of preserves, and the hope of a fresh start. The land here felt endless, yet empty in a way that kept her on edge. The stillness seemed too perfect, the air too quiet. She adjusted her grip on the leather reins, scanning the tall grass on either side. Every story she'd ever heard about outlaws and highwaymen seemed to rattle inside her head. And then she saw him. At first, just a dark figure astride a chestnut horse, cresting the ridge ahead. As he rode closer, his wide-brimmed black hat shadowed most of his face. A worn duster coat hung from his shoulders, and a revolver rested at his hip. His horse moved with the ease of one that had traveled many miles without rest. Charlotte's chest tightened. She instinctively pulled the wagon to a slower pace, but the stranger closed the distance quickly. When he was near enough for her to see the stubble on his jaw and the hard set of his mouth, he raised a hand. Not in greeting, but in command. "Ma'am." His voice was low, steady, carrying across the still air. "I'm gonna need you to stop right there." Charlotte's heart pounded. Her hands froze on the reins. He edged his horse alongside the wagon, his eyes flicking to the canvas-covered back. "What have you got in there?" he asked, though the question felt more like an order. Charlotte swallowed. "Just food and clothes. Nothing worth taking." The man leaned slightly closer, his shadow stretching across her lap. "That's for me to decide." His tone wasn't cruel, but it was unyielding, practiced. Her first instinct was to reach for the small pistol tucked beneath the seat. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way his gaze, hard as it was, didn't linger on the valuables. Maybe it was the faint hesitation in his posture, as though he were more weary than dangerous. Still, he reached a hand toward the wagon. Charlotte gripped the reins tighter. "If you're gonna rob me, get it over with," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The outlaw paused mid-motion. His eyes met hers, really met hers, for the first time, and for a heartbeat, something in his expression shifted. He didn't lower his hand, but the tension in his shoulders softened. His lips parted slightly, as though he'd forgotten what he was about to say. The wind stirred between them, carrying the scent of sun-warmed earth and the distant creak of prairie grass. That was when Charlotte knew. This man hadn't expected to find her here, and he wasn't sure what to do next. The man's hand hovered in the air, suspended in a moment that felt longer than it had any right to. Charlotte could see his chest rise and fall slowly, hear the leather of his gloves creak as his fingers flexed. He didn't move closer, but he didn't back away either. The sun was dipping lower now, and its orange glow painted the side of his face, catching in the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said finally, his voice quieter this time. Charlotte didn't answer. She just held his gaze, her heart thudding so loud in her ears she was sure he could hear it. The outlaw straightened in his saddle, and for a moment it looked like he might simply ride on. But then he dismounted in one fluid motion, the dust puffing up under his boots. His horse gave a small, impatient snort, shaking its mane as if in protest. "You got a name?" he asked, stepping toward the wagon. "I don't give that out to strangers who stop me on the road." Her voice was sharp, though inside she was trembling. He gave the faintest smirk, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fair enough." He glanced toward the back of the wagon again, but instead of rummaging through it, he leaned a forearm on the wooden sideboard. "Where are you headed?" She hesitated. "West. That's a big direction. It's all you're gonna get." Something flickered in his expression again, something between amusement and resignation. He shifted his weight, dust falling from the hem of his coat. "Name's Colt," he said, almost as if to prove he wasn't here just to scare her. "And before you ask, no, it's not the one my ma gave me." "Fitting, I suppose," Charlotte replied. "Depends on who you ask." For a few beats, neither spoke. The prairie wind whispered around them, rustling the tall grass on either side of the trail. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark sang its last notes of the day. Then Colt said, "You're not from around here. I can tell by the way you sit the reins. Too tight. You're holding on like you're afraid the ground's gonna swallow you up." Charlotte bristled. "I've been on the road for 4 days. It's not the ground I'm afraid of." He didn't flinch at the jab, but there was a brief, almost imperceptible sigh in his posture. "Look," he began, "I ain't gonna hurt you. I thought maybe you were carrying something worth trading for, but I can see you're just trying to get somewhere." Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "And what is it you're trying to get to?" His gaze drifted toward the horizon for a moment before returning to her. "Not sure anymore," he said quietly. It was an answer so vague she might have dismissed it, if it hadn't been for the way his voice dropped on the last word. There was weight there, a story. Before she could press him on it, the sound of distant hooves broke through the air. Both of them turned toward the east, where a faint plume of dust rose in the fading light. Colt's face hardened instantly. "Riders," he muttered. His hand dropped to the butt of his revolver, thumb resting on the hammer. "3 of them." Charlotte's breath caught. "Friends of yours?" "Not the kind you invite to supper." He turned back to her, urgency sharpening his tone. "You need to move. Now." She hesitated. "And you?" "I'll ride with you. Keep low." Without waiting for her agreement, Colt swung back onto his horse, the animal's muscles bunching under him like a coiled spring. Charlotte snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. The sound of their combined horses, the wagon's team and Colt's, mingled with the steady creak of the wheels, filling the heavy air. The riders behind were gaining. Charlotte risked a glance over her shoulder. 3 men, all in dust-stained coats, hats pulled low. Even at a distance, she could see the glint of metal at their sides. Colt rode alongside her, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead. "There's a wash about a mile up, dry this time of year. If we can get down into it, we might lose 'em." Charlotte's grip on the reins tightened. The wagon jolted over a rut, nearly sending her off balance, but she kept her seat. The sound of pounding hooves behind them was louder now, like a storm bearing down. "Why are they after you?" she shouted over the noise. "They're not," Colt said grimly. "Not yet, anyway." She didn't have time to puzzle over that answer. The wash appeared ahead, little more than a jagged cut in the earth, lined with scrub and loose rock. Colt spurred his horse forward, leading the way. Charlotte followed, praying the wagon's wheels wouldn't shatter on the drop. They plunged into the wash, the wagon tipping dangerously before righting itself. Dust and gravel kicked up around them, coating her throat. For a moment, the riders' silhouettes disappeared from view above. They kept moving until the sound of hooves behind them began to fade. Finally, Colt slowed his horse, turning in the saddle to scan the rim. Charlotte pulled the wagon to a stop, her hands shaking as she set the brake. "You could have just left me," she said quietly. Colt's gaze found hers. "Could have," he agreed. "But I didn't." In the dimming light, There was something different in his eyes. Not softness exactly, but the absence of the cold calculation she'd seen at first. "Why?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Because you looked at me like I was still human." Charlotte didn't know how to answer that, and before she could try, he was already dismounting, tying his horse to the wagon. "We camp here tonight," he said. "It's safer than going back to the road before dawn." As the last traces of sunlight vanished beyond the horizon, Charlotte realized she should have been more afraid. Instead, she found herself wondering who this man really was, and why he seemed as lost as she felt. The wash was quiet, except for the faint scrape of pebbles rolling under their boots and the distant croak of night insects waking up. Above them, the stars were beginning to appear one by one, pricking through the last veil of twilight. Charlotte kept her distance as Colt gathered a few fallen branches, his movements deliberate but unhurried. She could see the outline of his revolver under his coat, the way it rested easy against his hip. A reminder, sharp and cold, that no matter how civil his voice might be, he'd appeared in her path with the intent to take. Yet there was no rush in him now, no barked orders, no searching through her wagon. Just a quiet focus as he knelt and struck a match against a rock. The flare of the flame illuminated his face for a heartbeat. Rough lines, weathered skin, a shadowed jaw. Then it was swallowed by the crackle of dry tinder catching. Charlotte sank down on the wagon step, watching him. Her horse shifted nearby, tethered loosely, tail swishing at the occasional gnat. "Do you rob every traveler you come across?" she asked finally. Colt didn't look up. "No. That's supposed to make me feel better? Supposed to make you feel like you're still sitting here because I made a choice." She crossed her arms, bristling. A choice that could change again in the morning. He glanced at her then, a flicker of something, hurt maybe, before he looked back to the fire. "Fair enough." They sat in silence for a while. The wood popped and shifted, sending thin streams of sparks into the dark. Charlotte's mind wandered to the road behind them, to the three riders who'd vanished over the rim. She wondered if they'd find the trail again, if they'd circle back. "What do you have in the wagon?" Colt asked suddenly. "Not much. Some flour, coffee beans, a blanket, my tools." "Tools. I mend harnesses, repair wagons, fix leather work. Learned from my father." "Your father's still around?" The question hit sharper than she expected. "No," she said after a pause. "Died last winter." Colt nodded slowly, eyes on the fire. "Mine died when I was 15. Didn't leave me much, but a rifle and a bad reputation to inherit." Charlotte found herself studying him in the firelight, trying to decide if that was meant to be a joke. His tone was too flat for humor. "So that's how you ended up doing this?" She gestured vaguely toward the revolver at his hip. "Not exactly. I tried ranch work for a while, drove cattle from Texas to Dodge, did odd jobs, but sometimes the wrong company finds you before the right one does." "And you didn't fight it?" "I fought it for a while," he said quietly. "But you can't outrun a shadow when it's your own." The words hung between them, heavier than she expected. Charlotte looked down at her hands, fingers knotted together. "I know something about shadows," she said. "The kind you can't shake no matter how far you go." Colt tilted his head, waiting. "My husband," she said. "He drank, and when he drank, he stopped being the man I married. I left before winter, took what I could carry. Didn't tell anyone where I was headed." "That's why you're on the road alone." "That's why I'm on the road alone," she confirmed. For the first time, his eyes softened, not in pity, but in recognition. "Guess we both learned the hard way that sometimes the people closest to you can do the most damage." They sat with that for a while, the night deepening around them. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, the sound carrying over the dry earth. Charlotte shifted, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Those riders earlier, you said they weren't meat after you. You lying?" "No," Colt said. "They're after a man who double-crossed them in town 2 nights ago. But they don't like witnesses, and I had the bad luck of being in the wrong saloon at the wrong time. So if I hadn't stopped, they might have found you anyway. Roads like these don't forgive bad timing." She studied him, trying to decide if this was just another smooth story to keep her from bolting. But his gaze stayed steady, his posture relaxed in a way that didn't feel rehearsed. The fire burned low, casting a soft amber glow across the wash. Colt stood, fetched another armful of wood, and dropped it on the flames. "You could have kept going," Charlotte said. "Left me to fend for myself when you saw them coming." "I could have," he agreed again. Then, after a beat, "But I didn't want to watch another good person get swallowed up by bad luck." She felt the words settle somewhere deep, stirring something she hadn't let herself feel in months, a fragile thread of trust. "Colt," she said quietly. He looked over. "If you stay tonight, you'll eat what I have left of the coffee in the morning. And after that, we go our separate ways." He gave a small nod. "Fair deal." But as she turned in for the night, lying in the wagon under the thin wool blanket, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that when dawn came, their paths wouldn't separate at all. The first light of dawn seeped across the horizon, spilling pale gold into the wash. The fire had burned down to faint embers, and the air was still, that rare quiet before the day truly began. Charlotte sat up slowly, her back stiff from the wagon boards, and blinked at the shadowed figure crouched near the coals. Colt. He was sipping the last of the coffee from an old tin cup, eyes scanning the ridge beyond their camp. "Morning," she said, her voice rough. He looked over, nodded once. "We've got company." Her stomach tightened. "The riders?" "3 of them. Same as before. They've been tracking in from the north. Been watching us for a while, I think." Charlotte shoved the blanket aside and swung her legs over the wagon step. The horse snorted softly, picking up on her tension. "Then we go now." "That's the problem," Colt said, standing. "They're sitting on the trail ahead, and they ain't the patient kind." She hesitated, glancing toward the narrow road cutting between 2 low ridges. "So what's your plan?" He adjusted the strap on his shoulder holster. "We take the backwash west. It's slower, rougher, but it'll lose them if they're not paying attention." "You're sure?" "No," he admitted, "but it's better than waiting here for them to make the first move." Charlotte's hands trembled as she gathered her few belongings, flour sack, rolled blanket, her small toolkit. She climbed up onto the wagon bench, Colt taking the lead on horseback. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the dry ground. Every hoofbeat sounded too loud. Every gust of wind stirred a layer of dust that felt like it could betray their path. By mid-morning, they'd wound their way into a stretch of scrub and sandstone, the land folding in on itself. Charlotte could no longer see the open road behind them, only Colt's back, the set of his shoulders as he scanned the horizon. Then came the echo of distant hooves. Colt reined in sharply, turning his horse toward her. "They found the trail." She swallowed hard. "Can we make it?" "Maybe," he said, and for the first time she saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The sound grew louder, 3 riders, their pace steady, deliberate. Colt's gaze darted to a break in the rocks. "There's a cut ahead, narrow. You'll get the wagon through, but barely. Once you're past, keep straight for a mile. You'll hit a dry creek bed, follow it south." "What about you?" "I'll slow them down." "No," Charlotte said, gripping the reins tighter. "You ride with me. They'll be on you in minutes if I do." "Then let them." Her voice shook, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I don't need saving. This isn't about saving," he said quietly. "It's about buying you time." The riders were closer now. She could see the faint blur of movement between the scrub. Colt's expression softened. "You said last night you've been running from shadows. Let me make sure they don't catch you this time." Charlotte's throat tightened, and before she could find words, he turned his horse, pulling his revolver free. The next few minutes were a blur. She drove the wagon hard through the narrow cut, wood scraping rock as the wheels bounced over uneven ground. The horse strained, breath coming in harsh bursts, but they made it through. Behind her, the sound of gunfire cracked through the air. Once, twice, then silence. Charlotte didn't look back. She couldn't. The creek bed appeared as Colt had said, its sandy floor littered with driftwood and old stones. She turned south, urging the horse onward, every nerve taut with dread. It was nearly midday when she finally stopped. The heat shimmered above the sand, and her hands were numb from holding the reins so tight. She listened. No hoofbeats, no shouts, just the distant rustle of wind through the mesquite. She climbed down, her legs unsteady. "Colt?" she called, the sound small against the emptiness. Nothing. Charlotte stayed there for what felt like hours, watching the horizon. Each time a shadow shifted, her heart leapt. Each time it was nothing but wind or dust, it sank again. When the sun began to dip, she pulled the blanket from the wagon and sat beneath a mesquite tree. The quiet pressed in, heavy and final. She thought about the moment on the road, when he'd first stepped toward her, all rough edges and danger. How she'd felt the air tighten, certain she was about to lose everything she'd fought to keep. And how, somehow, she hadn't. By the second morning, Charlotte knew she couldn't stay. She loaded the wagon and started south, the road stretching ahead in pale ribbons of dust. It was late afternoon when she heard hoofbeats again, not behind her this time, but from the west. Her heart caught. A lone rider emerged from the scrub, moving slow. His hat was pulled low, his coat dusty, and there was a tear along the sleeve she didn't remember seeing before. Colt. She stopped the wagon as he approached. His horse was lathered, but his posture was steady, his gaze fixed on her. "They're gone," he said simply. Her breath left her in a rush she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You're hurt." "Not bad," he said, though the graze along his arm told her otherwise. "Bullet just kissed me." Charlotte climbed down, stepping close enough to smell the dust and leather and faint tang of gunpowder. "You didn't have to come back." "Maybe not," he said, "but I wanted to." They stood there in the quiet, the sun dipping low behind them. Finally, Charlotte smiled, a small, unsteady thing, but real. "You still planning to go your own way?" she asked. Colt looked past her at the road ahead, then back at her. "Depends. You still got room in that wagon?" She nodded. "Always." He dismounted, tying his horse to the back of the wagon. As he climbed up beside her on the bench, the shadows stretched long across the road, and the first stars began to show. Neither of them said the words, but they both knew the road ahead would be shared. For the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt the weight of her own shadow lighten. And Colt, the man who had once stepped out of the dust with a thief's intent, sat beside her not as a stranger, but as something far rarer, someone who'd chosen to stay.